Okay, hello, welcome. Good to see you again. The weeks go quick. I'm sure you'll agree. So this week we are turning to Saturn-Pluto complex. Last week we did Saturn-Neptune. This is the last week when we're really going to focus on Saturn, which in its very nature tends to be often challenging, like heavy, serious, weighty concerns. Particularly, I would say Saturn-Pluto. So what will help here is if you recall what we did in week four when we looked at the Pluto archetype. And then we've been doing Saturn kind of all along in some respects, but we did that in module two. So we kind of again pull the two archetypal worlds principles together, and that's how astrology works, that you've got two principles, and when they're in alignment, as we've seen in birth charts or in world transits for everyone or personal transits, they form a complex, a new archetypal complex, like the Saturn-Neptune complex. And with that, you get a whole array of different themes. And one person might be more attuned to one theme, one person to another. This is the idea of multivalence, as Richard Taylor's called it, that you've got the nature, the qualities, the themes of Saturn Neptune are consistent, but you don't know quite how it's going to manifest in your life. I don't know quite how it's going to manifest in my life. It's going to be different at the level of manifestation. But if you go back from the specifics of manifestation, the particulars, and you go back towards, up, as it were, towards the universal themes, that's where you see the coherence. So, um, again, to borrow from Eric Tarnas, archetypal coherence, themes are always the same: Saturn, Neptune, Saturn, Pluto. Concrete diversity, when those themes manifest, different for different people. So we're focused here on the universals, like the archetypal level. So keep that in mind, just a kind of reminder of that's an axiom, I would say, of archetypal astrology. That principle is made more explicit than you might get in a, regular astrology book where you open up, a certain page and read your two paragraphs about Saturn Pluto or Saturn Neptune, and it seems, in my view at least, more definitive. This is how it is, right? And this is what Saturn, Neptune, Saturn, Pluto means. We're looking here at as much range as we can manage in an hour or so, just to kind of give you the headline themes, and then the interpretive challenge, whether you're figuring out how something's going to manifest in your own life, or you're an astrologer doing readings, working with someone else. The challenge then is to connect those themes and figure out quite how they're coming through for that particular person. And if you're doing readings, those of you that are astrologers, you've just got to get people talking, and then because you can see the themes, you have the archetypal eye, you can help them connect. Oh, that's how your Saturn Neptune or Saturn Pluto is coming through, and so that's the idea. So there's that, and then just a word on an attitude, a perspective towards uh, challenging experiences. I mean, in many ways, all experiences are a little challenging, but ones associated with Saturn and Neptune, as we saw last week, which tends towards that kind of melancholy, disillusionment at times, and kind of world weariness and moral fatigue and so forth, which seem like negative traits, right? They seem like things that we would wish for ourselves to experience, but any of us who are involved in the spiritual life will know that those kinds of seemingly negative, difficult experiences are often the ones that um, lead us to insight, lead us to wisdom. That they seem to be essential for transformation, for individuation. So I think a positive attitude, if you can muster that in the face of these challenging experiences, can be really helpful. Try to see, no matter how difficult an experience is that you're going through, try to see the telos, that is the purpose, the trajectory, um, the transformative element that's working through you. So even if you're going through like a death, psychological death kind of experience, or you're suffering a lot, try to understand that in terms of what Jung calls individuation, that trajectory to becoming more than you are, to dying to your old ego, to realizing what Jung called the self, which is kind of the greater person that we also are. It's not an easy path. No spiritual path is easy. There are obviously positive elements. You can have epiphanies and dazzling insights and high moments and um, a felt connection to the divine and recognition of the divine in nature. There are many positive experiences on the spiritual path, but equally there are many seemingly destructive experiences, but these have their place. Right? Okay, so that's a little preamble as we consider Saturn-Pluto, which probably is uh, perhaps the hardest, certainly in terms of feeling to experience, to go through in one's life. Whether you've got Saturn-Pluto natally, like you might have a conjunction in your birth chart or a square, or whether um, usually once a lifetime you will get a hard aspect, that is a conjunction, opposition, or a square. You get a hard aspect transit of Pluto moving slowly around the zodiac. It will line up at one point in your life in a hard aspect with Saturn. And that tends to be a deeply transformative period. Saturn representing the structure of things, the structure of your life, um, the structure of your ego, and so it can have a kind of profoundly psychological dimension, even if you don't see that at the time. Um, Saturn Pluto is like sustained crisis in many ways. It can be traumatic because of the plutonic power, the instinctual power of the plutonic underworld, which is often it's ceaseless. It's like Freud described the id as like ceaseless in its desiring. It has a certain inexorable, relentless quality. So this plutonic flow of energy from the unconscious hitting up against Saturnian resistance. Seeing that Saturn is has much to do with negation, the no principle, pushing things away, repression, fear, whether it be fear of death, fear of destitution, fear of loneliness, fear of insanity. All those fears somehow are tend to be aspects of the ego complex, like the boundaries, the structures, the walls of the ego, which keep us locked in our egoic separation. So if we're to become more whole, we have to go beyond the boundary walls of the ego, and in that to that end, the action of Pluto on Saturn can be really valuable. However, it's obviously not a lot of fun to experience that at the time. So Pluto Saturn transits, particularly hard aspect, personal transits can be very hard. So too world transits. We only need to look back to COVID. The start of COVID, March 2020, there was a Saturn Pluto conjunction in the sky for everyone. Right? And not only that, there was like March 2020, there was a four-planet conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, all closely together in the sky. It's called a stellium in astrology, and they were all square to Uranus. There's a whole lot going on. And then if you go back a little further, the global financial crisis. There was another Saturn, Pluto, and Uranus, like 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, financial austerity, like the kind of hardship element of that period reflects Saturn, Pluto. There was a sense at that time of you often saw these words used like where the economic system is staring into the abyss, like and the abyss is the plutonic element, and it would just the structure was just holding. Um, and then the austerity measures in places like Greece, especially severe austerity measures, that comes out of the Saturn Pluto complex. Saturn is the limitation, the block, the problem, the burden, the hardship, and Pluto drives these to an extreme often, and it can be quite like a vice-like grip or pressure cooker experience. If you go back again and 2001 to 2004, 9/11 took place under a Saturn-Pluto world transit. Richard Tarnas has written a lot about this in Kosmos and Psyche. If you want to take a look at Saturn-Pluto world transits, but like that sense of in witnessing 9/11, the sense of like this is a major historical event. Like it's going to leave an indelible mark on the collective psyche. Collapse of structures, that twin towers being destroyed, fire, death. So too with COVID, that like doom scrolling and just being constantly exposed to death, suffering, lockdown, people in masks, bodies piled high. Saturn Pluto has a connection to the underworld, like plutonic underworld, and like sometimes almost like a hellish purgatorial entrapment has come through in Stanislav Grof's work. Maybe I'll say a little about that later. So themes such as torturing flames of hell, like apocalyptic scenarios, are expressions of Saturn Pluto. Saturn, again, the structure of things, and also death, the end of things. And Pluto's this tremendous elemental power coming up from the depths that can destroy everything. So you see, we're dealing with a really powerful, challenging combination, which has its destructive purpose or its destructive direction, certainly. And often that's what we notice when we're dealing with Saturn Pluto. But at the same time, probably the complex that fortifies us the most. Saturn as moral backbone, like just being able to stand in one's own ground, be one's own authority, or also judgment, like so moral judgment. Um, Saturn Pluto can really forge moral backbone, like and a kind of give one a certain gravitas, because like it's as if we're being forged in the fire. Like we're forged in the fire of experience, and we come out hardened, more able to withstand life, more able to marshal our resources with a more concentrated will. It's like ascetic discipline, Saturn Pluto. So many of these themes are a part of a religious life. They're not usually part of our conception of the Godhead, right? Although there are exceptions to that. Because again, the Godhead is Neptunian by and large, and we tend to think of like the God of love in Christianity or Christ and Buddha, altruistic, sympathy, empathy, compassion, and all those things. Neptunian. So the Plutonic, we've seen this already when we did the earlier week. The Plutonic gets pushed down into the underworld, that is, into the unconscious, repressed, or projected onto the figure of the devil in Christianity. So Pluto is like Hades, devil, Dionysus, Wotan, Pan, pagan, nature, chthonic deities that represents elemental, instinctual underworld power. Not easy to uh, access and integrate that kind of energy. Now, when it comes up in relation to Saturn, it can be that destruction of everything, like the end of days, like Judgment Day, apocalyptic, Book of Revelation type themes. It's not probably not you're going to not experience that in your own lives. You're going to get it in a more oblique way. For instance, I remember doing a reading for someone many years ago, and she had a Pluto transit to Saturn for about like 4 years, something like that. And we was talking about what it might be, and it turns out she was carrying twins. She was pregnant, carrying twins. So like carrying this like heavy labor. Um, Birth pangs, like the agonies of delivery, labor delivery, that's a Saturn Pluto expression, or carrying an immense burden. I'll show you the chart in a moment of Albert Camus, who the French existentialist philosopher who famously wrote a book on Sisyphus. You know, the myth of Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to push a huge boulder up the side of a hill, a mountain. And when he gets to the top, it rolls back down again, and he has to start over. And he does that. He has to do that task for eternity. And Camus got Saturn-Pluto. I'll show you in a second. And so it's like pushing that immense weight. Weight is Saturnian, gravity, like the burden we carry, the cross we carry, and Pluto's like titanic effort to push that up. So we might see Saturn Pluto in something as secular as working really hard, like just being having an immense amount of work, like what Thomas Berry, the ecological theologian, had Saturn Pluto in his birth chart, and he spoke about the great work of facing the ecological crisis, like this immense challenge, this world historic calling that those people who were responding to that crisis had to take on. And you actually see Saturn Pluto often in people who are concerned with conservation, like which is Saturn is to the conservative impulse, right, to protect things, and the immense challenge of the ecological crisis, like in figures like Greta Thunberg, Saturn Pluto, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's been very outspoken on environmental matters, Saturn Pluto. So I want you to appreciate that even though we might be talking about like hell and damnation and purgatory and apocalypse, end of days, revelation, which is definitely in the territory of Saturn Pluto, chances are in your own life, even though the combination can bring immense difficulty and can be traumatic, you're probably not going to get those like larger than life archetypal themes. However, you might well find that you are, you know, immensely burdened by something. You've got a great task that you've got to fulfill. All your energy is going into your work. You become very single-minded, almost obsessive. I think it came up last week, may have. Elon Musk has got, I think, Saturn trine Pluto. And I remember trying to think how that came through for him. And there's this, he recounts when he used to sleep in his factory, in his office, and be like working 20 hours a day. That's an expression of Saturn Pluto, where the Plutonic drive goes into the Saturnian world of work and duties and responsibilities. So just kind of try to appreciate that range. So if you've got a Saturn Pluto transit coming up, you know, I'm sure it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not going to be a load of fun, but it's not necessarily going to take you into like a hellish, traumatic death rebirth experience. It might, it might do that, but often it can come through more obliquely, where we're concerned with what we got to do in the world, our work, our responsibilities, and so forth. Because I think that's a key point to keep in mind. You know, we're dealing here with spiritual themes, religious themes. That's the focus of the course. But often they come through in life in ways that don't seem like they're, you know, they don't seem like part of a spiritual path. And we're being molded or transformed, and we don't even know it. But the way Pluto works, especially, is this underworld, unconscious. It's often very unconscious, and it comes through in our desperations, our compulsions, our drives, things that we just don't tend to readily recognize. And so we might be like very obsessed with doing something in the world, and all the while, even while we're doing our task, we're getting changed, and we don't even see it. So do try to be aware of that. Okay, so let me drill down into a few more details then. So I got a little clip from an interview with Marie-Louise von Franz, who's perhaps the foremost Jungian. She which is German. She collaborated with Jung. She helped him with some of his writing. She was very interested in a kind of reflection on the nature of archetypes and physics and mathematics, and she's kind of brilliant in her own way. This interview is from a documentary called Heart of Matter. I think it's called Heart of Matter. And what we're going to see is von Franz discussing a vision that Jung had toward the end of his life, an apocalyptic vision. Now, both Jung, with Saturn square Pluto, and von Franz, who had Saturn conjunct Pluto, are tuned into this complex. So what you're going to see is the apocalyptic theme in associated with that complex, and von Franz describing it. So I'll play the clip on YouTube, and then I'll show you their charts in a moment. And Galloway and I figure that we think we figured out the problem with the floating black boxes that we've had in previous weeks. So hopefully you're getting a more clear view when we get to the charts. Okay, so here we go. This is a little YouTube clip from Heart of Matter.
He had a vision at the end of his life of a catastrophe. It was a world catastrophe.
I don't want to speak much about it. One of his daughters took notes, and after his death gave it. And there's a drawing with a line going down, up and down, and underneath is the last 50 years of humanity. And some remarks about a final catastrophe being ahead. But I have only those notes.
Mm-hmm. What is your own feeling about it? The world.
Well, one's whole feeling revolts against this idea. But since I have those notes in a drawer, I don't allow myself to be too optimistic. I think, well, we have always had wars and enormous catastrophes, and I have no more personal fear much about that. I mean, at my age, if you have anyhow soon to go, so or so, egocentrically spoken. But the beauty of all the life, to think that the billions and billions and billions of years of evolution to build up the plants and the animals and the whole beauty of nature, and that man would go out of sheer shadow foolishness and destroy it all. I mean, that all life might go from the planet. And we don't know. On Mars and Venus, there's no life. We don't know if there's any life experiment elsewhere in the galaxies. And we go and destroy this. I think it's so abominable. I try to pray that it may not happen, that a miracle happens.
Okay, now before you get too alarmed, like Young and von Franz are attuned to this apocalyptic possibility because of the Saturn-Pluto complex, and one doesn't know whether a particular fantasy, even if Jung himself was the one having it, is a literal um, prophetic achievement to the future, or whether rather it's coming out of the depths of the psyche, and it's, because Jung would say, if your persona, like a key aspect of your ego, dissolves or dies, if your dominant psychic function, what he calls the collapse of the conscious attitude, if that happens, he said it always feels like the end of the world, right? So you can experience the end of the world for yourself psychologically, as much as it can be a literal apocalyptic scenario. Just as I mentioned during COVID, if you looked around on the streets in Italy and in New York in March 2020, it looked like an apocalyptic scenario. So I myself, not having Saturn Pluto perhaps, Jupiter Pluto, I tend to look more positively. But the warning, like the grave warning, the damning judgment, those are themes coming out of that Saturn Pluto, immense destruction, mass destruction, the end of everything. but it's an archetypal fantasy, right? And again, it can come through in just in one's moods and what how one imagines under the influence of this complex. Like if you look at song lyrics with people written at the time of Saturn Pluto, often they will talk about, this is the end of everything, and so it kind of comes through in less maybe dramatic, conspicuous ways. Nevertheless, it is a grave warning, but you get people maybe you were more attuned to the destructive Saturn-Pluto element, and then people like Thomas Berry and others, Al Gore's another one with Saturn-Pluto also, who are more concerned with like preventing the crisis, conservation. So it works both ways. The energy that's attuned to the apocalypse, the catastrophe, is also contains within it the solution, the response. So, and we're concerned here chiefly with the archetypal themes that we might encounter, if we are going through an ego death experience, common theme of religious literature, like you go a second birth, like you die, you're born again, and you're born again into the spirit, just as you were born biologically. So this is a religious theme. The death part of that experience had a lot to do with Saturn Pluto. So that's something you might encounter on your own spiritual journey. And if you look at figures who given a lot of their time and attention to describing this kind of experience, they tend to have Saturn Pluto. I mean, Jung himself and von Franz, Sri Aurobindo, the uh, famous Hindu philosopher who combined the Plutonic idea of evolution. Pluto is kind of evolutionary, instinctual, elementally empowered evolutionary direction. One side of Pluto. So he was concerned with the transformation of everything, the spiritual transformation of the whole of the material universe, coming out of his own Saturn Pluto. I think he had Mercury, Saturn, Pluto grand trine. We'll look at the charts in a second. But let me show you the charts now, and might be helpful. Okay, let's see. Any floating black areas, Galileo? We're all good. Look at that. We've purified and overcome. I just need to move my. All right, I'm just flicking through. Let's get to. Oh, so here's von Franz, and hopefully I can zoom a little. Marie-Louise von Franz, Saturn Pluto conjunction in a birth chart. She's also got an opposition to the Sun, Mercury, and Mars, so quite a Plutonic person. Um, just flicking through. Here's Aurobindo, who I just mentioned. And he's got Sun Pluto. I probably mentioned him during the Sun Pluto week. So that focus on uh, immediate focus on transformation. The Sun is like what is most central to us and our identity and our lives. And then he's got Mercury over here, the mind, writing, thinking, Saturn and Pluto in a grand trine. And those of you that, well, first of all, I recommend reading Aurobindo. If you want to understand Saturn Pluto, he wrote two huge volumes. One is called The Life Divine, probably his most famous work, and the other one is the Synthesis of Yoga. And he called his yoga integral yoga, because he was integrating a more traditional Hindu vision understanding of reality with a Western idea of evolution. He studied in England and learning about Darwin and evolution, and that influenced him. And it's just like what he said, that if you read his books, Mercury, that it's in itself, he felt that could have a transformative effect on us. And it's just like systematic, detailed description of every single kind of psychological, spiritual transformation you could go through, transforming the body, the vital, like the emotions and the vitality within us, transforming the mind and all these different spiritual levels down into what he calls inconscient matter, it's like on deep unconscious matter. So he just like it's a systematic step by step description, which is very Saturnian, the Saturn structure. These are the rules. This is how you do it. All in the area of Pluto, profound transformation. And he's also got the spiritual part of this comes out of the Moon, Neptune, Sun, Moon, Neptune, Grand Trine. It's kind of mystical attunement and natural mystical attunement. And he collaborated with Mira Richards, who moved over to India to be with him, and she became an embodiment of the mother, as he called it. I just had a chart a second ago. Oh, here we go. So he thought that she was like a living embodiment of the Divine Mother, and you can see she got a moon, the mother, feminine, opposite Neptune, and she too had Saturn in a sextile with Pluto. It's not as prominent. So the more the devotional side of spirituality, which you see in Aurobindo, is to do with Moon Neptune, a kind of gentle, sympathetic, imaginative attunement to the divine feminine. Um, so that is an element of Aurobindo within this like predominant focus on Saturn-Pluto transformation. There is another book, a little more accessible, that's Aurobindo's letters. So if you don't have like a lot of time and you just want a quick hit or just to like dip your foot in it and see what it's like, buy Aurobindo's letters. They're again full of like uh, profound Saturn Pluto advice about transformation. Okay, I wanted to show you Camus. Just bear with me while I flick through. Um, Oh, so here's Young while we're here. I mean, like, you've seen this before, but just to show you Saturn in quite a close square with Pluto for Young. So it's the same complex, a different aspect. Lanfranc conjunction. Young's got the square, but the same energies are constellated. The same themes are constellated. And in Young, while we're on the topic. If you want to see Jung's Saturn Pluto most vividly, there are a couple of places you can go. Like, read Answer to Job, which is Jung's controversial, provocative analysis of the character of the Old Testament God, Yahweh, in light of the suffering and unjust punishment that is inflicted on Job in the Bible. Um, the story is that Satan kind of tricks Yahweh or has a wager with Yahweh and said, "Look, there's Job. He's a very pious, devoted servant. He's a moral, upright man. But I bet if you inflict suffering on Job, pretty soon he's going to abandon his faith." And so all manner of ills and woes come Job's way. But and then Job has a dialogue with God. And so Jung analyzes this incident and argues that in a kind of judgment on a metaphysical scale, Jung argues that this shows that the God, Yahweh, the Old Testament God, is unconscious, at least morally unconscious. And Job shows himself to be morally superior to the divine. So, in other words, Jung is bringing Saturnian judgment, Saturn is the archetypal judge, to bear on the Plutonic unconsciousness, ruthlessness, immorality of Yahweh. Like Plutonic figure who can just destroy towers if they get too high and destroy whole cities of people if he wants. And in that book also, Jung discusses the book of Revelation, the biblical book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament, which is thoroughly Saturn-Pluto. I mean, it's like an orgy of violence and destruction. So again, if you want to saturate yourself in those themes, go and look at the Book of Revelation. Interestingly, Jung believes that the author of the Book of Revelation is John, and that's the same John in Jung's view who wrote the Gospel of John, which is a total opposite. It's just like a gospel of love, and there's no shadow element in that at all. Because Saturn and Pluto are both attuned to the shadow, and so Jung felt that the Book of Revelation was like a compensatory shadow side of John's Gospel, if indeed they are written by the same person. So yeah, so Saturn Pluto's shadow. Saturn is shadow inferiority, judgment, guilt, like, where you feel weak and self-conscious and embarrassed and ashamed. It's more like the acutely personal shadow, the things that you find, where you don't have confidence and you judge yourself and you try to meet the standard. And then Pluto is the shadow in a different way, like the shadow of civilization, collective shadow, the shadow of the human race, perhaps evil, anything that's not considered part of uh, um, compatible with civilized society. So, lust and rage and um, kind of primal, bestial, barbaric qualities are all in the area of Pluto. So if you look at that, you've got this tremendous like reservoir or repository of energy that's locked up in the underworld that might be expressed, and it's libido, it's just natural, elemental, instinctual energy, but it's designated evil, right? So then it becomes very hard to access that if your religious orientation or your ethics forbids you from even entertaining an evil thought, then how can you access that energy? How can you integrate it? It becomes very difficult. This consideration is itself in the area of Saturn Pluto, because Saturn is repression, like the moral boundary, the judgment about what is allowed, what is good, what is not, and what is pushed away. And so in dealing with Saturn Pluto ourselves, we often have to uh, undo repression, our own psychic repression, or rather that happens to us. It's not something you can necessarily choose or will, but Pluto can act on Saturn to intensify fears, right? Drive repression to an extreme, and thereby, through that extremity, burn it out, destroy it. If you're thinking of Pluto, think of like, flame, fire, conflagration. Like in alchemy, the Plutonic term or Plutonic operation is calcinatio, which is like a fiery transformation. There's a fiery heat that's burning down the Saturnian structure, whether it's the structure of the world or the structure of one's ego. So this intensification, this heating up of fears, repression, negation, to such a degree that the repression is destroyed and undone. If the repression is undone, then that allows us access to the plutonic and other elements of our experience that had been denied, that we hadn't had access to, that fallen into the shadow, that have been repressed previously. And if we are to become whole, if we are to move beyond our limited ego, and if we are to marry somehow our higher spiritual ideals, the God of light, you might say, our attunement to love and light and all the positive spiritual values that we revere, if we are to marry that to nature, our own nature and nature at large, we have to go through this process. We have to be able to bring up from the underworld the instinctual powers in our depths and civilize them and integrate them with our consciousness, and then we can pull like heaven and hell together, right? Um, and so yeah, so that's Jung in answer to Job. And if you have the time and the interest and the inclination, you might want to look at Jung's alchemical writings because thoroughly Saturn Pluto. Just it's a complicated topic, but alchemy basically is taking something unredeemed, like a base metal, right? So a Saturnian matter substance, and it's applying transformative processes, operatio called, to that matter in order to, in the alchemical fantasy, to create gold. But Jung reads this whole thing spiritually, psychologically, as do some of the alchemists, in fairness. So the gold, the sought after gold is not material gold as much as spiritual gold, like the realization of the self, the philosopher's stone, the lapis. But the whole process of alchemy, of uh, torturing the metal, was kind of an expression that the alchemists used, like breaking it apart, heating it, transforming it, the intense labor of doing this day after day. The alchemists were just obsessed with this quest, a single task of creating the philosopher's stone. So that intense labor, intense Pluto, labor, Saturn, like just focusing on something obsessively day after day, transforming it, the work of transformation, Saturn work, transformation, Pluto, the underworld struggle, Pluto underworld and Saturnian struggle. Like Jung often used the term Herculean labor, like in describing how he faced his own unconscious. It's like a Herculean labor, like, again, underworld work, right? So this is very prominent in alchemy, a different side of Jung's Saturn Pluto to the answer to Job. So you've got facing evil, Saturn Pluto, also um, this metaphysical judgment of the unconsciousness of God, underworld labors, alchemical transformation. All these are major Saturn Pluto themes. But again, it's not to say that you will overtly experience those if you've got Saturn Pluto in your birth chart or transit, but you might be able, if you can look skillfully, to see how some of these themes are showing up in less obvious ways in your life. I think that's how it tends to work. I mean, it might be you have a full-on like ego death experience under a Saturn Pluto influence, right? Could be, but I think for most people, no, that's probably not going to happen. Um, okay, I was on my way to show you Camus. Here we go. This is an interesting chart because it looks like a teepee. I mean, this triangle. I say you looking at this, Saturn and Pluto are not in conjunction, right? And so if you look at the degrees, I don't know if you can see them or whether I need to zoom in a little more. So Saturn is about 17 degrees um, at Gemini up here, and Pluto is just into Cancer, and Pluto is 1 degree Cancer. So it's a very wide orb. It's like a 14-degree orb conjunction. So it is just about a conjunction. You go to about 15. But because this line here is the midheaven, because that's right in the middle of Saturn Pluto, it pulls the two principles together in a more significant way. It's called a midpoint. So in addition to looking at whether you've got conjunctions and oppositions, you can look at does an angle, like the ascendant or the midheaven, or a planet, another planet, fall exactly in the middle of two other planets within about like 1 degree either way. You've got a little wiggle room, but it has to be precise. Then you would say, well, there's a midpoint aspect. So it's another kind of aspect worth looking at. I mean, this one visually is kind of obvious, with Saturn and Pluto both being at the top of the chart, and very manifest in that myth of Sisyphus. In that case, it's like the relentless or unrelenting labor. Like Camus was concerned with the meaningless suffering and labor of human existence. And that's why it can seem like that under Saturn Pluto, like you're just crushed by work, right? Or you just you can't get to spiritual illumination because you're so singularly focused on the work that you're doing, and um, can be hard, like hardship, Saturn Pluto. But if usually I think if you look deeper, you can see through that work, through the labor, you're getting transformed. It's like an ascetic discipline. It's like, you're the Buddha who's meditating 24 hours a day and not eating and becoming emaciated and having no worldly comforts in order to like overcome himself. That's a Saturn Pluto theme. So yeah, again, we're probably not going to follow that path and become like the Buddha, but it might be in what we're called upon to do in life, what is pushed onto us that uh, all we see is the work that we've got to do, and we don't see the background transformation that the work is making us do. It's like we're getting our ascetic discipline, but we don't know it. It's not like we're choosing it. But if you know about Saturn Pluto and you know it's connected to that theme of ascetic discipline, then you can meaningfully participate in the hard labor that you're doing, and knowing that it's not just about the labor, it's about what its effect psychologically on us, right? Okay, so yeah, so that's Camus. Let's see, what else did I want to touch on? I've got a couple of clips. I'll play the clips. It'll be a little change up. So what we're going to see here is Lord of the Rings. Tolkien has a minor aspect. It might be a sextile Saturn Pluto. Tolkien is a Neptune Pluto Jupiter figure where you got this mythic transformative underworld journey. The journey is Jupiter, like the epic. Particularly Jupiter Pluto is an epic quality. But the film versions of Lord of the Rings came out in 2001. Fellowship of the Ring was right at the end of 2001. So this is the same world transit as 9/11, September 2001, of Saturn opposite Pluto. So the film series particularly vivid portrayal of Saturn Pluto themes, like intense underworld struggles against monsters and everything they went through, that kind of ordeal quality, the initiatory ordeal of that journey that you see in Lord of the Rings with Frodo and Gandalf. And there's one scene that I'm sure you're familiar with where Gandalf is confronting the Balrog. And the Balrog is this like underworld, monstrous, dragon-like underworld creature surrounded by fire in the abyss. And what we'll see in this clip is Gandalf is like the wise old man, Saturn. We saw that connection to Saturn, who's carrying, he's got the kind of fortitude and attunement to the good, you might say, the kind of stern moral stance that he's standing up to the underworld energy. So I'll play the clip, better than me describing it. Just let me share in a different way. I did my best to do pre-buffering, so we'll hope we're not interrupted by ads, but you never know.
Return to the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun! Go back to the shadow. You shall not pass!
Okay, enough to give us a flavor of that. I mean, the intensity, the whole setting is very plutonic, kind of underworld, dark flames, this monstrous power coming up from the depths. And Gandalf is attuned to Saturn. That is, um, how do you put it? A kind of learned traditional wisdom. Like if you've assimilated the religious traditions of your upbringing, like if you've like let's say you're Christian, you've taken in Christian values, then you can refer to them and they can be your Saturnian like anchor, your stake in the ground, your staff, in this case, to face the plutonic devil, monster, demon, shadow, right? Um, because there's obviously a danger in facing that within you, within all of us. Because the dragon, I think, symbolizes this long repressed plutonic underworld monstrous power, right? Uncivilized, barbaric, bestial, primitive, all these kinds of terms suggest that it, threatening, overwhelming instinctual power within us, which needs to be tamed, civilized, contained, if we're gonna integrate that energy. But when it first manifests, particularly, it can be, wild and uh, uh, monstrous, as we saw there. So if you can reference then like your understanding of what it is to be good, like, and you have your moral commitments, your responsibilities, then you can use that to stand up to the plutonic monster. And I think that's what we see there. Gandalf is like stopping, you shall not pass, like that Saturnian barricade or wall that's confronting the plutonic underworld as it comes up. Um, in some ways, you probably need to be devoured, right? You need to, like, I think in a later part of the scene, he goes down into the Balrog, and that's part of it. Like you got to be pulled into the underworld, but you also do need that moral attunement to established values, traditional values, like religious discipline, that kind of thing, to help in dealing with the plutonic devil. And then another major religious theme that is connected to Saturn-Pluto, at least in some sense, is the crucifixion, because Pluto is the animal within us, and so you could say that in the spiritual life and the spiritual path, the animal human within us needs to die, and part of that. And that's not to say that spirituality is opposed to like the animal life of the body, but the, the domination by the animal instincts, where we live unconsciously and compulsively, that seems to need to be overcome. And that theme is suggested by the crucifixion, where the merely mortal animal human is killed, right? So you got the agonies of a slow death. Um, which you often see with Saturn Pluto. Pluto intense, sustained, Saturn slow death. Like so the crucifixion, it means many things. It's obviously represents sacrifice, and it has a Neptunian quality and ascent to heaven ultimately. So it's not wholly Saturn Pluto, but like immense suffering, like being torn between the opposites, um, dying to what one was, ego death experience as really powerfully symbolized in a crucifix. And you see actors who kind of portray crucifixion themes in their work, like Mel Gibson and The Passion of Christ. He's got Saturn-Pluto in his birth chart. And I've got a little clip here of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian, also in a crucifixion scene. So I'll just play like a 30 seconds, give you a flavor of this. Just enough to give you a little sense of that. And I don't overdo it on the suffering element of Saturn Pluto, even though it is often quite prominent. Um, okay, I think I've covered most of the stuff I wanted to. I mean, I just mentioned another figure with Saturn Pluto, and that's Paulo Coelho. I think someone might have mentioned him in earlier earlier session. Um, and I don't know if you know much of his biography. Brazilian, he wrote The Alchemist, right, appropriately, but his parents put him in a mental institution when he was younger, because he was kind of a little wayward teenager, and then at some point in Brazil he was captured by the government and tortured, and they're both expressions of Saturn Pluto. Also, he became obsessed with Hitler. I remember reading a biography about him, and that's a Plutonic figure, if ever there was one. I mean, Hitler himself didn't have Saturn Pluto, it's Neptune Pluto. Kind of we'll look at that another week maybe. But yeah, so I think a lot of figures involved in spiritual writing, particularly those that are concerned with transformation of some kind, like death, rebirth, transformation, are attuned to Pluto in one way or another. And in the ones I've seen, many of the examples have Sun Pluto and Saturn Pluto, like Friedrich Nietzsche, who I mentioned before, both of those. So like he describes a Sun Pluto Titanic Übermensch, like and heralds the descent into the underworld. Like we saw that in the Sun Pluto week. But equally with Nietzsche, you got like immense suffering, labor of transformation. He talks about being born and like being the mother going through birth pangs and the pain and agony of labor. He uses that metaphor, which is very Groffian. Stanislav Grof, Saturn Pluto, Czech psychiatrist, his entire life has been devoted to helping people go through second spiritual birth, relive the agonies of birth, and be born again. He's kind of like a midwife in that process. He's got Moon, Saturn, Pluto, Moon, Mother. Um, yeah, so a lot of figures that are concerned with the sustained work of transformation, and are expressing their own Saturn, Pluto. Okay, I will stop there and turn it over to you in case you've got any questions or comments. And yeah, all yours.